Jesus Christ stated to all of us in Matthew 24 that we should be watching world news. Therefore, he set the precedence by saying that we as his people, when we see all the signs that he gave that he would be returning to this earth, that we should be watching world news, and I call it in the light of Bible prophecy because that's exactly what it is. And so Jesus did give a compilation of all the Old Testament prophecies in one book. And then we have to fill in the details based upon the information that we have. In Revelation 1, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Notice it's servants, plural, not just the Apostle John, but it's those at the end of the age, because the phrase shortly come to pass means when these events come, they will rapidly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John. In verse 10 is a time setting for what we're discussing today. He said, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and heard behind me a great voice. Now it says I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Now that is a preposition, on, and it could have been translated any one of four prepositions according to the context. It could have been on, in, by, or at. And since it's talking about a time period, the end of the age, the day of the Lord's day, it's talking about time. And so literally this should have been translated, I was in the Spirit in the Lord's day. It's like John was propelled forward into our time to see events that were transpiring at this time in history. Now in Revelation 13 is called an inset chapter. This brings us up to date as to what's going on when all of these seals and trumpets began to be opened. Verse 1, and I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast, and a beast is government. You can compare that to Daniel chapter 7. And this beast or government would rise up out of the sea, and it's the sea of humanity. And so it's going to be a world government. But it's going to be a blasphemous system, so it cannot be Christian. And that's one of the keys to all of this. In verse 2, the latter part of the verse at the end tells who it is that is backing the rise of this system. And the dragon gave him his power, his seat, and great authority. And we know who the dragon is. It says in Revelation 12:9, that great red dragon, Satan, the devil. And so he's deceiving the whole world, but he's also got permission from God the Father and Jesus to build a world government at the end of the age. And he has great authority. Notice in verse 4 that he's going to require worship of this dragon, Satan, through this human being. But then the question is asked, who is like unto the beast, this powerful government? How could it be so powerful in an age of independence, supposedly? Who is able to make war with him? This government, that is. Then drop down to verse 7 and notice something that most in Christianity do not like to be able to admit is going to occur. And it was given unto him, that's this beast government, empowered by the dragon, to make war with the saints and to overcome them, martyrdom of Christians. And power was given him over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. So here we see that there is coming on the scene a world government. V.I. Lenin said, way back in 1921, who was the first ruthless dictator of international communism, he made the statement, here's our plan. Number one, we'll take Eastern Europe. He did it by the end of World War II. Then he said, we will take the masses of Asia. He did it by the early 1950s. Then he said, we'll surround the United States. And Nikita Khrushchev even went so far as to say, we won't even need to fire a shot. We will conquer the West. We'll surround the United States. That'll be the last bastion of capitalism. And it will fall into our hands. And they created an alternative program in case there was resistance. In the 1930s, Dmitry Manuelitsky gave his program to pretend weakness, collapse, and then they would rebuild and have a surprise attack upon America if it resisted the New World Order. We have heard in the 2008 presidential elections, both candidates calling for change. What did they mean when they said change? Was it change for the good for the American people? Was it to bring it back under the constitutional republic which we were founded upon? And our coins, in God we trust, instead of the new gold coin that is being distributed by the post office where the word in God we trust is taken off the coin, the $1 gold piece. What did they mean, change? There has been a plan since the 1930s to use the word change in every single election for a president of the United States. Now, what did they mean by the word change? It's not by accident that the dreadful situation threatening the collapse of the Constitution of the United States has come before us in our generation. The catastrophes and the crises that we now face in America, whether economic, politically, militarily, it does not matter. They were all created, they were engineered by devious political planners and conducted by elected public officials. People went to the ballot box and elected them. But they were pretenders. They were like political actors on the stage, and someone else was pulling the strings. They were, in every case, a conniving internationalist working for one world government and dissolve the sovereignty of the United States of America. There is bona fide evidence for this, and we have presented it over the years since 1980 with the very first publication of Newswatch Magazine. The simplified history, and then I'll expound upon it, is that there is a presidential brotherhood that started in the 1930s. The methods were laid down in order to bring our country to its present undesirable circumstances. Those presidents, the very first one, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, hired a man by the name of Charles Merriam to lay out the program in which they would dissolve the United States of America to merge it into a world government with international communism. Harry Truman followed. Dwight David Eisenhower had his part in it. John F. Kennedy had his part in it, and then began to renege on certain things, so they had to eliminate him and bring in a very willing person, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Richard Nixon called for the New World Order, Gerald Ford, and then his successor, Jimmy Carter from Georgia. Then Ronald Reagan, who is hailed even today as the most conservative of all politicians that have been in this century since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I did a video on him when he was governor of California, or the legislation that he signed into law as the governor of California, showing that every single piece of legislation was nothing but socialistic. And when he became president, Everything seemed to be okay. People were jumping for joy that a conservative had taken office, and yet he ran up more of a budget and overruns than all presidents in the history of the United States combined, showing that he was no more of a conservative than a doorknob. And then there was George Herbert Walker Bush, who announced the New World Order 210 times. Then Bill Clinton, and then George W. Bush, and now the President-elect Barack Hussein Obama. The key to everything I'm going to say today comes from something called the politics of change in local government reform. This was written a long time ago, and it finally was made public by the Freedom of Information Act. The proof is in this as to why they use the phrase change over and over and over. It shows who is orchestrating it, where, when, and how they are engineering all of these catastrophic events that are going to bring America into the New World Order. Remember, proof is always what we want to stand upon. Over many administrations, the presidents have built what is called a parallel government and have put it on standby. They haven't told the American people there are two governments working in the United States. The constitutional government, but as it's being watered down and becoming obsolete, the parallel government that they're building and have been building since the 1930s is standing by to become the new government of the United States. It will be reached and implemented only after far-reaching planned disasters occur to force a change into the standby parallel government, and we'll discuss what that government is. It's a parallel government that operates under unlimited military powers. That's why Revelation 13, verse 4 said, "Who can make war with the beast?" The groundwork has been laid. All they have to do is, when the right moment comes, they can legalize it in America and merge us into an all-powerful world government. The two major parties, Republican and Democrat, are in league with the objections of this presidential brotherhood. That's why no matter which president wins at the ballot box, they put in the same old people to run the government, fill cabinet positions, and every one of them are the ones that are bringing disaster upon America and stripping us of the Constitution. This is why McCain and Obama were chosen to represent their respective parties, because both men are change agents to continue our emerging into a world government. The politics of change and local government reform is of great value to you to understand the banking crisis that's going on in America right now, that it has its roots in very devious planning. It will end up with a new system, a new money system. There are some premises underlying the uses of mind manipulation. This is what they have laid down in their plans. They must learn how to manipulate the minds of the average person. And it's important to understand how they're going to counteract your resistance or my resistance to the New World Order. First of all, they said a goal had to be set, which is not compatible with the will of those that believe in the Constitution of the United States. It's only compatible with those Marxist socialists that are working for world government. Secondly, they said to obtain that goal, a majority of the citizens must be moved to accept it. How will they do that? They said in this program they would use lies, deceit at every level of government. No wonder we've reached a crisis in America. Then thirdly, they said the means had to be devised to bypass all resistance. So they've created various types of organizations to create arguments to support themselves, and anybody that objects to it, they know how to put them down and look ridiculous. That goal was stated in the first occasional paper of the Rockefeller General Education Board all the way back in 1906. Essentially, it was to return you and me and the whole world to a serf-type existence, just like it was in the Middle Age, with a few, like the kings, ruling over the vassals. Everyone would be slaves, and no one would own property but the elite. This is what they want to return the world to, and they laid it down. To achieve a docile people, people who will not resist what they're trying to promote, they decided they needed a number of immediate objectives in which they would work on each generation as they grew up. Number one, they said they needed to eradicate the historic concepts of the Christian religion. Have we seen an assault on Christianity in America today? Remember, this was laid down in 1906. And the Rockefeller Foundation, their educational board, is what laid it down. Second, they said they needed a world organization to bring influence to bear universally in every country in the world. Thirdly, they said they had to eliminate artificial political boundaries. Now do you understand why we never have a wall built to keep the southern neighbors out of America? Do you understand why we have open borders? Because they want to get rid of all political boundaries. There will be no United States, there will be no Mexico, no Canada, but it will be the North American Union. Fourth, they said they needed selected officials, not elected officials. When someone is elected who was selected by the Illuminati, and you and I cast votes and it doesn't matter, their man is going to win that they want, then he selects his officials. They're not voted upon. They're never turned down, no matter what their socialist, communist background is, no matter if they're members of the Skull and Bones, Bilderbergers, no matter what it is, if they're working for world government, no matter if they're treasonous to the Constitution of the United States, they're never vetoed. They're always allowed to go into positions of government. And that was planned in 1906. Fifth, they said they needed to amalgamate all races of the world into one huge population. Eliminate 90% of the population of the world and then amalgamate everybody else so there would be no white, no yellow, no black race. This was their plan in 1906. Six, they said they needed to control transportation, communication, education, money, and agriculture. We'll see if they are doing that today and have done a marvelous job of deceit and deception against the American people. Number seven, they said they needed a management system to control such a massive undertaking. Now, all the problems that are created in the United States today are all because they are pursuing their goal of a one-world government. Every problem can be traced right back to it. And their battle cry is change. What did we see in the 2008 election process? The battle cry was change. Change and more change. That's all that was talked about. So they created what they call psychopolitics. Psychopolitics is the art and science of obtaining and maintaining control. Once you obtain that control, you have to maintain it through all generations, over individuals and over the masses of the population alike. It holds that a degraded nation, remember this concept, a degraded nation has no defense against conquest, and that a nation is only as principled as its people. In other words, our institutions in Washington, D.C. will only be as good and clean and wholesome and righteous as the individual character of the people. A continuing strategy in this war has been to degrade the citizenry of America. They have used uninhibited sex. That's what the Illuminati came over in the 1800s and told those meeting in New York City, Horace Greeley and the rest of those guys, that they would use free love, free sex to destroy the country. Yes, uninhibited sex is the ultimate weapon in degradation of a society. The promotion of every conceivable debauchery, including raw sex in the schoolrooms called sex education. It's been an accelerating tactic that has been going on, and that's why they don't want parents in the schools anymore. It's insidiously eroding the morals of this nation, and anyone would have to be blind not to see it. Because the way people live determine the morals that they have. And look at our nation and the morals that we have. We have no ethics anymore. We don't live by principles anymore. We just live by the flesh. Whatever feels good, do it. And by means of these types of assault, both personal and institutional integrity are being debauched. The result is paralysis of the will of the people to resist the New World Order, the United Nations, international socialism, communism. Today you could call it apathy, indifference. You can't fight City Hall, so who cares? Let's live while we can. Then they employed what is called brainwashing. It's one of two prongs that they're using in this psychopolitics. This is a term that describes the process by which indoctrination is accomplished in society and in individuals. The other prong is mind changing. Those who have been in MK Ultra in the past know that there are advanced methods of mind control. Mind changing is nothing more than the process of converting one set of values to another. So they said they could take a Christian and in no time have them declaring that God is dead because of brainwashing and mind control. Could this be so? Apparently it is. Look at all the ministers that fill the pulpits in America today. They deny the Bible, that it was inspired. They deny that any of the miracles really happened. They deny the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. Elements for planned change were, number one, a collapse of government's ability to provide needed services. Number two, a crisis of major magnitude. Did we see the 911 Twin Towers go down at another one of the building in the Trade Center area? All of them go down, demolition style. Third, they said a catastrophe that has a physical effect on the community was needed. Fourth, they said they had to corrupt local officials. Number five, the high cost of government and the desire for higher level of services. So you raise the high cost of government so it nearly bankrupts them. Then you get the citizens to want more services that cost more and more and more. This is called the change in politics. This is what the change is all about that has been talked about in the 2008 elections. Now, underlying all of these activities is a recognition that the general public would resist the planned change to socialism. So their intent was to bypass that resistance. How could you do that? If you're going to capture America, you had to have a way to bypass it. So variants of change strategies were identified in a number of critical areas. They wanted to institute changes on the federal level by accumulating all power in Washington, D.C., when the opposite was to be true. All power was to be to the state and to we the people, and only certain limited delegated authority was to be given on the federal level. They had to reverse all of that in order to make their program work. So they began to penetrate back in the 1960s by using specialized training institutes. They're called think tanks. In California in the early 1970s, a specialized training institute to indoctrinate peace officers was begun. They began to teach them the techniques of controlling and suppressing political dissent, specifically including the use of force against citizenry of America, which might resist a tyrannical takeover of our legitimate government. Remember, all of this was laid down in 1906, but it took time for them to get it going and implemented. It took a socialist, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to begin the process. Basic to individual liberty is the tenet of the uninhibited liberty of your mind. You must be able to think for yourself. But when you are mind controlled, when you are controlled by the political, and they have the military force to put down your thoughts, then you could never resist and think for yourself anymore. Conditioning of the mind is blatant abuse of that inherent right which God gave to every man to think for himself. But in addition to being a right that was given to us by the Constitution, under the New World Order, no one will think for themselves. The elite will think for you and conditioning of the minds of the citizenry is tyranny. That's all it is tyranny. But what about this change? What have been changes in the past that have already affected our government? Now, when you have changes, a part of the program is you must maintain those changes. Never eliminate them. Make them permanent. What did Nikita Khrushchev say? He said that they would send liberals into Congress and they would pass legislation, and America would one day wake up and have communism and not know how it happened. It's called change. The battle cry is change. Conquest of our republic, crushing it to death by this change monster has been going on since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The change process has already quietly revamped the United States of America so that we are now in accord with the military concepts of a regional basis for global management under the United Nations organization. Then they're trying to enforce upon us and every state government the real ID card. This would bring us under the militarized command and control of Homeland Security Agency for global government operation. All of this could be found in a document called the Houlihan Report. Its plans were to have instigators, individuals who would be change agents. That said in the Houlihan Report, they had to be willing to lie to gain what they wanted to achieve. They were called change agents to use deception and sedition. Now, what has happened since that time? What kind of change has taken place since the 1930s? I'll just hit a few highlights here, and then later on, even more. The General and Complete Disarmament Program with the United Nations was signed by John F. Kennedy. It's better known as Public Law 87-97. It says within that document that every single person must give up their firearm. The Second Amendment to the Constitution will become obsolete. Also, the elimination of the 50 states, and this basically has already been done. It would be replaced by 10 regions, which it already has been done when FEMA was passed. The North American Union would be to merge the United States, Mexico, and Canada into one North American continent, just like the European continent. Then there would be unrestricted immigration. You could go from one country to the other and the borders would always be open. Now do we understand why no politician will get the borders closed? The plan has been in effect since 1906 with additions here and there. But this is the Houlihan Report. Then they wanted the collapse of the American dollar. Does it look like it's collapsing right now? It looks like it. Even a communist in South America, Chavez of Venezuela, has called for, once this economic crisis is over, to create China, a one currency. France and Chavez have called for a one world government to finalize the New World Order. Then the change also that has been made in conquest of our republic to change it to a socialistic form of government. has been the national identification card. Now, only paperwork is used in communist countries to go from one location to another. But if we receive this real ID card, as it's called, it will constitute our consent to be governed in a new international government. And then more changes that have occurred is that all businesses would be nationalized. What is communism? State-owned business. They control businesses. What is the United States doing but trying to talk their way out of it so the American people won't recognize that they're formalizing socialism, communism in America? It's called the big bailout of $700 billion. And every business in America is lining up behind it. And when the government subsidizes it, they will control it. They even said that. The government would own part of it. This is a change that is taking place. And then the Bill of Rights and the United States Constitution no longer is applicable. It's just a point of fact. You won't have the right to own a gun anymore. The Second Amendment will be gone. President-elect Obama has already had a history of calling for gun control. Why do we think in 1993 they ran the survey out there in California at 29 Palms Marine Base asking, would you confiscate guns if our government said so? And if people would not give up their guns, would you be willing to fire upon them to prepare them for the ultimate change? Change is the name of the game. And then civilian law enforcement merged with the military under Homeland Security. Whether our local police officials like to admit it or not, they are now nationalized under Homeland Security. Listen to what a man by the name of Philip Dormer Stanhope, he was the 4th Earl of Chesterfield. He was a statesman and a diplomat. This was recorded in Miscellaneous Works, Volume 4, 1779. Quote, "Let us consider that arbitrary power has seldom or never been introduced into any country at once. In other words, they're not going to introduce socialism, communism all at once. It must be introduced by slow degrees, and as it were, step by step, lest the people should see it approach. The barriers and fences of the people's liberty must be plucked one by one, and some plausible pretenses must be found for removing or hoodwinking one after another those sentries who are posted by the Constitution of a free country for warning the people of their danger. When these preparatory steps are once made, the people may then indeed, with regret, see slavery and arbitration or arbitrary power making long strides over their land. But it will be too late to think of preventing or avoiding the impending ruin." End of quote. Little by little, step by step. That's what they said and what is happening in America starting with 1906, laying the plan down by the Rockefeller Foundation, their educational board. And it's been implemented, and as I will show, if not in this message, maybe a follow-up, every single president since the 1930s with Franklin Delano Roosevelt has had their part to implement a new change, but maintain the changes that have already been made. so that we can go progressively, step by step, to a socialistic country and not even know what happened to us. The federal government has consolidated all power unto itself in order to build this new world order. The politics of change and local government reform is what they're using today. They are pushing the United Nations. Wasn't that what George Herbert Walker Bush said when he talked 210 times about the New World Order? They had to rebuild the United Nations and give it implementation for force. Yes, they wanted power to be given to it. So what have they changed in recent times? There is now a battle going on to retain the Star-Spangled Banner. In case some of you didn't know that, national borders are under attack because of the North American Union. The Bill of Rights that give us the freedom of speech, freedom to own a gun, freedom not to testify against ourselves, is being eroded. Gun rights are being eroded. The Constitution of the United States does not hold up to what it used to be because they interpret the Constitution to give it a totally different meaning than what our forefathers wrote. The Declaration of Independence is under attack, as all our coins are too, because they carry the words, "In God we trust." The 50 states are under attack to be broken down and lose their identity into 10 regions. The United States dollar is under attack. More debt is controlled by the Chinese communists than even Japan. This is American debt. Therefore, at any time they want, they can use that as a leverage against us. Counties in each state are under attack because sheriffs are the highest office in a county and are supposed to defend that county from tyranny. But now, because of subsidies from the federal government, the counties and the cities are now under the control of the federal government in Washington, D.C. Special districts have been created. The sovereignty of America is eroding. Now, they won't tell you that because they're building a parallel government. They want you and me to think the Constitution of the United States is moving forward while they've got a parallel government going along with it, and they're taking certain rights away from here and turning them over to the other government, which is the United Nations government. The United Nations Charter was unlawfully ratified as a treaty. It didn't qualify as a treaty because it calls for general and complete disarmament of the United States. State Department publication number 7277. Any kind of instrument whatsoever that would come into conflict with the Constitution of the United States cannot become a legal treaty. That is the law. Do you think they're going to tell you that's the truth? No. When you tell a lie big enough and long enough, people begin to believe it. And so they began in the 1940s when the United Nations Charter was being adopted, saying that treaties override the Constitution. Well, if that's true, we've never had a constitution to begin with, because treaties were signed at the very beginning of this country, and they would have overwritten all of our freedoms which we've had for all of these years. So the United Nations treaty cannot be a treaty that we have to live up to. The United Nations itself was not a sovereign government at the time that this so-called treaty was prepared and ratified. On this basis alone, the so-called treaty could be declared null and void. Treaties are only good between a recognizable nation and another nation. Years later, March 19th, 1970, the United Nations declared itself to be a sovereign government. And you know, the only newspaper that carried that was out in Anaheim, California, where the meeting took place. At the time the United Nations Charter was ratified as a treaty in 1945, the proponents of world government began the move from theory into implementation of the United Nations world government. Yes, they assisted by advancements they gained through the use of executive orders, which are illegal other than telling your staff what to do, what plates to set on the table for dinner. That's what an executive order was for to begin with. And then by presidential decision, they have now made the United Nations a world government. Legislative acts of the United States Congress was also used. So the United Nations grew and grew. You cannot have a lawful treaty that supersedes the principles of the United States Constitution, nor the conferment that they give to these endowments, because they violate the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. One United Nations treaty calls for the complete disarming of every American citizen, turning all of our military over, and the men that are engaged in the military, over to the United Nations to be used only by the United Nations to keep world peace. Well, anybody that's studied the United Nations and wherever they go know that there is no peace where the United Nations go. The charter to the United Nations is nothing more than a charter to declare war on people that they are trying to bring under control to this world government. No nation can survive after its common defense has been seized by a foreign government or so-called government, and then when their citizens have been totally disarmed. No government can survive it. Germany didn't. Russia didn't. All of these things happen in advance. In the Act of 1945, United Nations Participation Act, and then the 1949 amendments to the United Nations, all should be revoked, rescinded, and repealed if America is ever to return to its greatness. But we have a problem. The problem is this was declared a Christian nation. The people lived by Christian principles. They didn't have all the truth of the Bible, no. But they at least lived by 9 of the 10 commandments. This was until the 1950s and early 1960s when everything began to really take effect. And so America has turned its back upon God. As a direct result, He will not slumber and sleep. As a people or as a nation, we will not mock God. That's the problem that we're seeing today. We've turned away from the true and the living God, and therefore He has given us time to repent. He sent people to tell the nation to repent. They wouldn't do it. And so, just like in ancient Israel, God is going to allow these things to occur to them. But the formula for the operation of all that is going on today was conceived by Charles E. Merriam. He was hired by the Rockefeller Foundation and placed in the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration to begin to implement the changes that needed to be made. Merriam, who believed that the outright revolution was the old style. In other words, you can't take arms and go into a country and overthrow it. Not as big as the United States and as powerful. So he said that we must infiltrate and change it from within. And here's what he said, quote, "Fortunately, our Constitution is broad enough in its terms, flexible enough in the spirit, and capable of liberal enough interpretation by the judiciary to permit the adoption of democracy to changing conditions without serious difficulty," end of quote. He went on to state in his written literature that he wanted to substitute the word democracy for republic, and that the word democracy would be a stand-in word for socialism. So what are they changing? They are changing from our Republican form of government, representative form of government, to a socialistic form of government with no representation whatsoever eventually. Sir Winston Churchill had something to say. I'll quote, "If you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed," this is what he was telling their country during World War II. "If you will not fight when your victory will be sure and not so costly, you may come to the moment when you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance for survival. There may be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no chance of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as slaves," end of quote. Winston Churchill is the one who wrote in the Sunday Daily Telegram about the Illuminati and named people in the great cities, the undergrounds of Europe, Russia, even in England and the United States, that were trying to conquer the world. He knew what he was talking about. Country after country, if they didn't recognize what was happening to them in time, they would either die trying to receive their freedom, or else they would be reduced to slaves. Look at the Russian Empire. They have been reduced to slaves. George Washington had a few things to say. Of course, this was long before 1906, but he was very well versed on what had happened in Europe. He was well versed as to what happened with the French Revolution when the Illuminati tried to overthrow that government, killed off a third of the population. Quote, "One method of assault may be to effect in the forms of the Constitution alterations, which will impair the energy of the system, and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown," end of quote. Isn't that exactly what's going on? Charles Merriam said we can't overthrow it with a frontal attack, military, so we will infiltrate it. We will alter the Constitution, and George Washington warned about it. He said again, quote, "Guard against imposters of pretended patriotism," end of quote. Has anybody seen the picture of Obama, Hillary, and a couple of other people standing in front of an American flag and everybody with a hand over their heart except Obama? Pretenders. Another quote by George Washington, "If we desire a secure peace, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war," end of quote. What has State Department Publication 7277 done? It has caused the reduction of our military bases down to the number that the New World Order will need to train people to control against resistors. Another quote by George Washington, When firearms go, that's our Second Amendment, it all goes. We need them every hour. End of quote. And this was all in his farewell address. He said, he warned us to resist with very careful care concerning the spirit of innovation, people wanting to change the meaning of the Constitution, the constitutional principles. And yet that's what Charles Merriam said we have to do. We have to change. So they started the program of change agents and instigators of change. And they said if we can only have one man that is in control of all the change, and he has the ultimate authority, it will be easier than if we have to go to all the people in the 50 states that are representatives and senators. What have they done? They've made the presidency just like a dictator so that he can sign executive orders to change America, to change the Constitution. George Washington went on to say, don't listen to their fine speeches as to why things have to be changed in the Constitution. If you even suspicion someone is trying to change it and abandon the Constitution, act quickly to preserve it. These were his words way back. Then he made another very startling statement, quote, government is not reason. It is not eloquence. It is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master, end of quote. That's why George Washington warned about people changing the Constitution so that they could create a tyranny and a dictatorship just like they had on the European continent, and the kings that claim divine right to reduce everybody to slaves. America was the only nation that did not become slaves to their government. But now our government is under assault by change agents. George Washington wrote a 64-page draft of his intended 1789 inaugural speech, but decided that it was too long, so he laid it aside. But a couple of excerpts from it, quote, but until the people of America shall have lost all virtue, in other words, we've abandoned the Christian religion, until they shall have become totally insensible to the difference between freedom and slavery. Yes, and our young people growing up don't even know the difference anymore. When they're on the welfare system, they are in slavery to the government. Only what they want you to have to exist. Then he went on to say, until they shall have been reduced to such poverty of spirit as to be willing to sell that preeminent blessing, the birthright of a free man, for a mess of pottage. That's what's going on in America today. We've sold the magnificent birthright out for a soup line and a few goods at the welfare office. In short, he said, until they shall have been found incapable of governing themselves and ripe for a master, those consequences can never arrive. End of quote. In other words, our government can never be overthrown unless we become poverty-stricken of the spirit. What has happened to America today? We have become poverty-stricken of the spirit. It wasn't that people wanted it that way, but we were deliberately undermined. by those change agents who are in the government. There is crime going on in America today, and I don't mean the drug lords. I don't mean the people that go into the 7-Elevens and so on and rob them. No, there's a different type of crime, and that is that there are people in secret changing the Constitution of the United States to a socialist form of government. They have already laid the groundwork through signatures on documents that has transformed America into a dictatorship. They've already done it. Why do we think President Bush can act like he does and go around doing the things that he does? It has no approval from the people within the United States, but it still happened. All 50 states will be forced to disappear when this military government expands. It's called the Security, Prosperity, and Partnership Plan. Some people call it NAFTA plus, meaning a trade agreement plus on top of that. It will be a one continent instead of the United States, Mexico, and Canada being three separate countries. They will be merged into one. That's what the Washington Times said December 1st, 2002. They said it's criminal activity that this is going on, and that the United States of America, the citizenry, most of them don't even know that it's happening. Just a few people down around the border in Texas know what's going on. And they've held town meetings because they've been told their land was going to be taken away from them under eminent domain to build this corridor to connect all three countries, which communist China will unload their ships in Mexico and in Mexican trucks, bring them all the way up into America, up into Canada, all the way to Alaska. And so America will once again lose part of its sovereignty. When this Homeland Security came into being, it reshaped the government of the United States. It brought us under 22 agencies with 120,000 employees. And the thing is, agencies are not responsible to the people. Only the representatives are, the senators are. But agencies are not. So we have been dislodged as a republic, and it will not be a very convenient place to live anywhere on planet Earth once they pull the strings. It will happen. It will happen. But there are ways to force changes upon the American people. You and I don't necessarily sit around and think of these things, but there are people that are paid to. They're called think tanks. They're globalist. And there is a deliberate plan to collapse the government of the United States. I've already mentioned it. It's called the politics of change and local government reform. It's also known as the Houlihan Report. And in the Houlihan Report, it gives us the climate which this country must be brought to so that we will permanently change our form of government. Here are some of the conditions that are being engineered and have already been engineered to implement change. There will be others. Number one, it's economic changes. What could cause an economic change in America? Well, how about a stock market reversal? Instead of going up, it goes down. Have we seen it? How about businesses being allowed to move out of the United States, stripping us of our economic base, manufacturing base, throwing millions into the soup lines and unemployment, headed for the welfare office? How about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Organization, undermining American trucking and farming? You ought to see the movie sometimes called Border Town, based upon the truth. It will make you sick at your stomach as to what is happening, and they tell that NAFTA and those people in authority want it this way. And then what about overloading the infrastructure? Remember, this is economically. Overloading our hospitals to the point where they collapse, go out of business. Maybe our Social Security system, with foreigners being able to participate in the Social Security system by paying into it only 3 months. Yet they're not legal citizens. How about just plain inflation? A house in Dallas, Texas, 3-bedroom, 2-car garage in 1962 cost $12,500. Same one, $175,000 today. Is that called inflation? That's exactly what Marxism is all about. Debauch the currency of a nation and you'll cause the nation to collapse. These are all things that are engineered to change America from a republic into a communist dictatorship. What about physical changes? Not just economic. How about border realignments and revisions within the United States? What about counties being dissolved? States being broken down into 10 regions under FEMA? What about our national borders now being removed? This is a physical change that allows anybody to come into our country, whether they're terrorists or whether they're real, legitimate individuals that just want a better living standard, which most are. But then on physical changes, what about the alteration in the operational standards, reversal of laws in this country? What about treaty processes that physically change our country? Executive orders that undermine our republic? What about what is called today public-private partnerships? Nothing more than socialism wrapped up in a different spelled name. What about alterations physically that diminish our safeguards as a nation from foreigners coming in? Creating cells to blow up our cities, to unleash biologicals upon us. How about physical changes that will weaken the principles of the Constitution? Our institutions that were once Christian. How about bringing in the ACLU, a communist front organization to destroy everything Christian in America? How about suing eHarmony, which was founded by an elderly Christian man, and they had only heterosexuals, and now they've been sued by lesbians and gays, and they have to create a whole different website for them. Why is it America, the Christian, is the only one discriminated against and everybody else can do whatever they want and say whatever they want? Physical changes. How about merging the United States into foreign alignments, NATO, CETO, and so on, so that we have to go to war in case one of those countries are attacked? This is all happening. It's real. What about foreign entanglements, which George Washington said never get involved with them? Trade and get out of the country and don't get entangled in foreign affairs. These have all resulted in wars in Iraq, wars in Afghanistan, war in Europe twice, war in Korea, war in Vietnam, and then supposedly the war on terrorism, when it's not terrorism, it is radical Islam, a religion that says all infidels must die. What about social changes? These are change agents inside of our country right now. They want to devalue the Christian morals and ethics of the family. Why do you think there is everywhere on television and the courts are upholding same-sex marriage to undermine Christianity in this country? Social changes. How about making partnerships with communist countries, which are forced atheistic countries? What about alterations in the educational teaching standards in America so they can undermine Christian morals and teach what is called sex education and bring in homosexuals into the classroom to show, well, they're no different than anybody else. They just want to be loved. How about acceptance, installation, and then the application of the mind-altering techniques that have been applied to the educational system in America today? These are all social changes. They've been applied to the law enforcement systems. Law Enforcement Assistant Agency started in California and spread out across the country. It's a change in the way law enforcement is carried on. Then what about change agents in America who are instigators? They influence the media. They say what can be heard by the public. Most of them are members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and they're on the board of directors and control ABC, NBC, CBS, and many other of the national communications networks. They condition public thinking, how you're supposed to respond, and how you are directed in a certain position, and you don't know how to resist that position. And they chastise anyone who will not go along with their program. Any talk show host or television, they will see to it they're taken off the air or given bad exposure so people won't listen. Then these change agents are producers of false security to the American people through television, false information. Didn't we see that? And that's why we went into Iraq and attacked them. When there were over 500 lies that were told, and over half of them by the President of the United States, and yet they never took him up on perjury charges. And Cheney and Colin Powell was right behind him. No, lies are being told over the airwaves to make people apathetic, indifferent. How could they be so stupid? How can our government do that? Don't they know it's so simple? No, you're not supposed to be able to determine what they're doing. They want to control and reduce all resistance to the changes that are taking place. They want to bring the entire American people to a similar consensus that this change needs to be made. But it's a socialistic change and an abandonment of the Constitution. Then if all else fails, they want to introduce fear into every citizen who might oppose their plans, that might dissent and exercise that freedom of speech against them. Yes, the United States is in trouble, my friends. It just is. But there is a quiet civil war that is being waged inside the United States. It's being waged against our constitutional republic. It's being waged against you and me as an individual. Presidents, every single president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt has had a part in it. You should read, if you can ever find it, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He published a report in 1937 called Our Cities. And in that, he began to show how they had to change and bring all the cities and the states under the control of Washington, D.C. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They had to start the alteration process, and they did. George W. Bush has altered the concept of operations that have been going on since the beginning of this country, to a degree that he is, and I'll say it, and I'm not embarrassed by it, that he is way past suspicion of sedition and treason. Only if you know the program can you say that. If you don't know what they're doing, you would never even dream of such a thing as happening. Changing our constitutional republic, changing it to a socialized government. They have replaced the Bill of Rights with the United Nations human rights treaties. But the human rights treaties never tell us any rights that we, the people, have. Merging civilian law, the enforcement systems in this country where the military is something never done in a republic in the history of the world. Never. Unless it's being converted slowly, step by step, into a dictatorship. Yet it's been done in America today under the Homeland Security Agency. Yes, President Bush has had such presidential directives, number 51, number 20, and so on, that has elevated himself with extraordinary powers for a president, something that has never been done in the history of this country. He has now, through those presidential, national security, presidential advisory directives, has now placed the Homeland Security under his personal jurisdiction. What does that mean? It has paved the way for a full-blown dictatorship to rule over the lives of the people of the United States of America. Can we believe these things are real? They are. This is the way you create a dictatorship. You follow the plan, the Houlihan report. You follow Charles Merriam and his program to infiltrate and make changes by one president. Then another president come in and he's assigned certain changes to make, but he maintains the ones that have already been made by the previous president or presidents. And so you're little by little adding socialism, until finally you have overthrown the government of the United States of America. It's happening right before our eyes, under our noses. But do you think they're going to come out and say that on national television? Not a chance. But who funded these agents of change? Who did it? In mid-August of 2007, the Ford Foundation announced the retirement of its president, a woman by the name of Beresford. She resigned after 18 years at the helm of an $11 billion organization that has funded so many left-wing, which is socialist communist programs, that it's not even funny. It has been amazing what they have done. But the truth is that the Ford Foundation and their grants to far leftist organizations and anti-American organizations can be found in an expose of all of them in a man by the name of Phil Kent's new book, or Kent, K-E-N-T, Phil Kent's new book, Foundations of Betrayal. He shows in there very definitely that these foundations, the Carnegie, the Ford, the Rockefeller Foundation, and a host of others, have used their funds in the educational field to teach collectivism. But they did it in such subtle ways that teachers don't know that they're teaching collectivism. The students don't recognize it, but it's coming into their brain. It's a permanent part of their education now. He shows how they started way back when the Reese Committee investigated them in 1954 and 55. The Reese Committee came to the conclusion that they were one of the worst enemies of the United States of America. Foundations, tax-exempt foundations owned by these wealthy people. In this book that Mr. Kent wrote, he came to the conclusion that wealth controls the culture. Foundations have used their wealth to change America, and it started with the Rockefellers in 1906, with the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller Educational Board that he created. He said, because wealth improperly used has altered the culture of the nation and led it to the left, socialism, communism. He said they funded John Dewey's socialistic program in textbooks for the schools starting in the 1930s, 40s, and so on, to turn America into a communist state. He went on to show how the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations funded socialistic brainwashing of generations of American youth. They used their grants, scholarships, and what is termed as fellowships in order to have textbooks written so they could turn the American people toward socialistic goals. He devoted an entire chapter on the Kinsey reports. Some of you may remember that they were run back in the 1950s and 60s, mainly the 60s, where they took a man from New Jersey named Alfred C. Kinsey from Hoboken, New Jersey. And he is the one who started his publication called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. They took this, and then he went into groups of homosexuals and said there's no difference in heterosexuals and homosexuals. They all have the same desire. So they began to pervert truth, and they displayed it as if it were true that you could do anything you wanted. You didn't have to be confined by biblical principles, and the assault began upon the morality of Christians in America. and it worked. Look around at America today. How many young people save themselves for marriage? Think about it. How many of them by the age of 14 or 15 have illegitimate offspring? Think about it. Where did it come from? It was unheard of in my day in the 1950s when I graduated from high school and went to college in 1959. No, you were prim, you were proper, you had the date home by 10:30. And anything after that, the parents said, it can only cause trouble. And that was true. You went on a date, took them to the movie, stopped, got a hamburger, took them home. You didn't go out parking for hours or going to your own house or bedroom and so on. The culture of America had to be changed. So the foundations have done it. Listen to what Michelle Obama had to say. Quote, "We," meaning her husband and her, "have committed ourselves to building the world as it should be." Not America. He's only president or going to be of the United States. But he's now talking about committed to building the world as it should be. But what about John McCain, who opposed him? Quote, "Change and reform," end of quote. What was it said in the Houlihan report? Change and reform. Hillary Clinton said, quote, "Change must start from the bottom up, not the top down," end of quote, meaning you and me, Mr. and Mrs. Citizen. Sarah Palin had no concept of any of this. The drive for world government. She was just an innocent person, governor from Alaska, who brought a great deal of enthusiasm onto the national stage for John McCain. She had no concept of what's going on, so she could not know to oppose Homeland Security Agency as illegal. She didn't know that. She didn't even know that her own Alaska had been brought under that system of government. She just didn't know it. But what about Joe Biden as a vice presidential nominee and now looks like going into the White House as the vice president? On April 23rd, 1992, in the Wall Street Journal, under the topic Counterpoint, Joseph Biden made a few interesting statements to show you why Mr. Obama needed his, quote, experience, end of quote, in his administration. Joe Biden made the statement, "All honest debate over America's proper role in the New World Order." He knew about the New World Order. He just said there's a debate as to what America's role should be in the New World Order. Then he went on down in his article and said, quote, "But most Americans, myself included, reject 1930s style isolationism." What did George Washington say? Go in and do your trade and get out quickly. Make the nation an isolationist nation. You won't be entangled in foreign governments that will destroy you. He said he's for the opposite of being an isolationist. He said global problems, and I'm quoting him, require global solutions. Well, where does that put him? Right on the bandwagon with every president before him who were going to make changes, because they were the instigators of change. They were the change agents placed in the White House. He said, I would support preemptive military action if necessary. Why not have an anti-proliferation czar in the cabinet to give this objective the prominence it urgently needs? So he wanted to have somebody as a cabinet level position that would not allow the United States to build any more nuclear weapons to defend itself, any more buildup of the military to defend itself. What did George Washington say? If you lay aside your guns, you're dead as a nation. You've got to be ready at every moment to defend the Constitution of the United States. And the last quote I'll make out of this article, he said, Americans to trust their security to a global committee. So he wants America to trust our security to a global committee. Now, who would that be? The United Nations organization. The United Nations organization. Listen to what Mr. John McCain said. Now remember, he was the other choice of globalism as opposed to the one that won. That's for globalism. Quote, we understand who we work for. We don't work for a party. We don't work for a special interest, and we don't work for ourselves. We'll work for you, and we'll put our country first, and that's what this campaign is all about. Change and reform. Change and reform. End of quote. But they never told the American people what this change and reform was going to be. From the constitutional republic to a socialistic world government. They didn't tell us, but they knew. That's why they were put on the tickets. Once again, I will quote John McCain. Let me offer an advanced warning to the big old spenders. Do nothing. Me first, country second, Washington crowd. Don't you love the way they call each other names and all of a sudden one becomes a Secretary of State to the other? Don't you just love it? Then he said, change is coming. Change is coming, and it's coming to our nation's capital. We'll clean it up. End of quote. Sorry, they're dirtying it up just a little more. Just a little more. As I said, Sarah Palin knew nothing of any of this. She was totally in the ignorant side, which means no knowledge of this plan for world government. She can't be blamed for being for John McCain because she had no idea, but he did. That's why he was selected on the Republican side and Obama on the Democratic side. I want to quote Republican presidential candidate John McCain. Here's what he told Americans, quote, with our Democratic friends and allies around the world, we need to build a new global order of peace. End of quote. A new order of peace. Now that was McCain's speech, May 1st, 2007. It was to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in California. He described this as an organization that could, and I'm quoting, bring concerted pressure to bear on tyrants in Burma and Zimbabwe with or without Moscow's or Beijing's approval. End of quote. Same speech. In essence, fulfilling the same purpose that the United Nations Security Council is supposed to fill. That's what he was saying. All you have to do is remove Russia and China's veto, and you have your new world order of peace. That's what he called it. He went on to claim that he would, quote, start bringing democratic principles in nations around the world into one common organization. A worldwide league of democracies, a league of democracies. This would not be like the universal membership and fail League of Nations of Woodrow Wilson, but much more like Teddy Roosevelt envisioned. Like-minded nations working together in the cause of peace. End of quote. That was the same speech. But now, what did Teddy Roosevelt say when he wanted to create this League of Democratic Nations who had similar interest? I will quote him. Theodore Roosevelt. What is needed in international matters is to create a judge and then to put police power back of the judge. The one permanent move for obtaining peace, which has been suggested with any reasonable chance of attaining the object, is by an agreement among the great powers, in which each should pledge itself not only to abide by the decisions of a common tribunal, but to back by force the decisions of that common tribunal. They should furthermore agree not only to abide, each of them, by the decision of the court, but all of them to write or to unite with their military forces to enforce the decree of the court against any recalcitrant member. End of quote. Isn't that nothing more than the United Nations? Isn't that what they're doing? They're wanting all power in the International Criminal Court to dictate to nations what to do, and if they don't do it, they want all the military of the world under their disposal to attack the country that refuses to come under their jurisdiction. And this is what John McCain wants. He's not president and won't be. But it appears that his league is exactly the same, a United Nations organization. But there was a man by the name of Clarence Street, S-T-R-E-I-T, of an organization called Union Now. And he said that there are incredible changes going on around us. He was talking about the presidential changes that are taking place in America today. Through executive orders, through presidential decision directives, which are not voted upon by the Congress, by the Senate, House of Representatives, we the people, or state legislatures. We as a nation are under attack. And there is a great armada of change agents that have infiltrated into our government at the highest level. As I began to bring this to a close today, I want to mention some of the changes that have already been made in America. The end of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights are now nearly obsolete. Because of State Department Publication 7277, they have already passed it into Public Law number 87297, which states that at the proper time, all of our Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, the entire military equipment we have, including nuclear weapons, would be turned over to the United Nations, which I've proven in so many times. The United Nations was founded by communists, run by communists, and can only produce a communist one-world government. The federal seizure of state law enforcement systems has now weakened the sovereignty of the individual states. The Houlihan Plan, with 5 ways to ensure failure of government, is being implemented in America right now. The merger of the military and civilian law enforcement breaks the Posse Comitatus Act, which forbids the military to police American citizens. That's why they were in the streets of New Orleans, going door to door, confiscating private citizens' guns when they had broken no law whatsoever. This will take us toward a dictatorship soon. The United States of America is no longer an industrialized society. Our manufacturing base has been sent overseas or south of the border by presidential decisions that President Bush and others, Clinton before him, signed. The Office of Management and Budget controls all states directly through their planning offices, and it forces federal mandates upon these states, but the states are required to pay for them themselves. Then there are 10 federal regions called FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, which basically abolishes the power of the states, has already occurred under Richard Nixon. Propaganda, the press keeps pumping out propaganda to keep the people ignorant of what their fate is going to be when this new world order that is described in Revelation 13 takes place. Then schools that were created to educate our children became consolidated under federal rules and regulations. They're now creating in the schoolroom world citizens through the Health, Education, and Welfare Department of the government of the United States. Presidents have never been stopped from transforming the republic into an international world government by executive orders, presidential decision directives, and by treaties. They've never been stopped. Eventually, because of State Department Publication 7277, there will be no guns for citizens. Their rights will be overridden by international law. Then, the tax-exempt foundations are the ones responsible by financing all that is going wrong in America today. They are financing the merging of the United States of America with communist countries. To be exact, the head of the Ford Foundation at one time said that they received directives from the President of the United States to so alter or change the lifestyle of America so they could comfortably merge it with the Soviet Union. That should tell everything. Then there are also toll-free charges that Americans are now paying to Spain because they have taken over many of the highways, the interstates, and are charging tolls. This all came about because of NAFTA and presidential decision directives that were signed by President Bush. Big businesses moving out of the country, all under direct orders of the federal government to redistribute the wealth of the world. Pure Marxism. And who is it that is coming into the White House in January 20th, 2009, said they had to redistribute the wealth? Pure Marxism. power behind the presidential office is the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the ultra-billionaire group called the Bilderbergers, the Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller Foundations, and a multitude of others, all moving America toward a socialist world government. Then going to be forced upon the states are the real ID card to transfer all the people under the authority of the Homeland Security Agency and eventually transfer us under the world government, because they will have a system of tracking every one of us. Then, of course, what we're seeing today is the weakening of the American dollar and bankruptcies everywhere to bring us into the New World Order. All of this has been done by presidents of the United States. I want to read an article now as I close this message. The article is entitled, "New President, New Constitution, New Bill of Rights." Quote, "Is there a better way for America? Is that grand freedom experience our founding fathers so carefully subscribed to? The Constitution, is it old hat? Evidently, Barack Obama thinks so. Obama plans to radically reinterpret our founding documents, turning it into a state manifesto complete with a second Bill of Rights." Now, when he said state manifesto, that means the state is in charge of everything. In an interview with a Chicago public radio station, Obama complained that the Supreme Court, which was created by our founding fathers in the Constitution, never ventured into the issues of redistribution of wealth and sort of more basic issues of political and economic justice in this society. Obama went on to explain that the Constitution, in his view, was a charter of negative liberties. Obama explained, "It says what the states can't do to you. It says what the federal government can't do to you. But it doesn't say what the federal government or the state government must do on your behalf." Given his remarks, it is clear that an Obama presidency will not preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Rather, it will change the Constitution to suit his ideology, an ideology that is far different from the one held by our founding fathers. I'm going to interrupt this just for a moment. If anybody's been watching who he's filling his cabinet post with, the same old Council on Foreign Relations guys from the Bill Clinton administration, all of them one-worlders, no different. Everything will continue as is, but he's got to do his part to maintain all the changes that have been made to alter our Constitution towards socialism, and then add his job on top of it. Now I'll continue. Recently, Obama, surrogate and U.S. Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, Democrat from Ohio, fired up a crowd before Obama took the stage, telling them that America needed a second Bill of Rights that gives all Americans state guarantees of welfare. Will that put everybody into the category of a serf in the Middle Ages? Dependent upon the government for everything? That's exactly the last step before they pull the string for dictatorship. Indeed, this need for a second Bill of Rights, one that guarantees welfare from the state, is something that Obama's longtime constitutional advisor, Cass Sunstein, has advanced. In his book, this is Sunstein, The Second Bill of Rights, FDR's Unfinished Revolution and Why We Need It Now More Than Ever. He said all legal rights are or aspire to be welfare rights. Welfare rights. The few of us who are left working will pay for the welfare of everybody else. Or the government will just print money so that when we work, our money will be devalued and it will be worth nothing. That's why socialism never works. Everybody looks for the handout, and the few that do work, they're penalized to pay for those that won't work. Anyway, he went on to say that if the nation becomes committed to certain rights, they may migrate into the Constitution. Wow. Simple change. They might just migrate into the Constitution. The article went on to show that Mr. Obama's longtime friend, William Ayers, of the Weatherman Underground that blew up, that set off bombs in New York and the White House and different places back in the 1960s and 70s, right on up till 1979. Well, he went down and was on stage with Chavez, dictator of Venezuela, communist dictator. He went on to show that the entire way that Chavez worked his way into the presidency of Venezuela and then in 5 minutes turned it over to a dictatorship. How that they had passed law after law after law and then in 5 minutes turned it into a dictatorship. That is exactly what Obama is doing in America, or going to do, because of presidents before have laid the groundwork, and he is to maintain everything they've done and then add the next directed part of the socialistic step. So what did change mean in 2008? What did change mean? It meant that they will continue to change us from a constitutional republic to an international socialist communist government, preparing to merge us with a world of communism for a one world government. The sins of this nation has caused this to occur. This was God's nation that He gave as an inheritance because of Joseph. And it's found in 1 Chronicles chapter 5, 1 and 2. Joseph's sons inherited this wealth. We declared ourselves a Christian nation. We've turned our back upon it. And therefore, God said in Daniel 12, verse 7, the last part of that verse, that He would scatter the power of the holy people. Is He in the process of doing it? I believe He is.